Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always ready to explore.
Awesome. Well, today we're tackling a topic that I think is going to be pretty fascinating.
Sounds good to me.
We're diving into the Panama Canal.
Ah, yes. A vital waterway with quite the story.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. 5% of global trade goes through this one canal.
It's incredible when you consider that, isn't it?
Yeah, and 70% of all that cargo going from Asia to the US relies on this passage.
It really underscores the canal's importance.
Absolutely. So the question is, why is this relatively small channel such a big deal?
That's what we're here to unpack. It's a story that begins with a dream, actually, way back in the 1880s.
Okay, so take us back. What's the origin story here?
Well, Ferdinand de Lesseps, the brilliant engineer behind the Suez Canal,
Oh, yeah, he's a legend.
he figured he could repeat his success, connect the Atlantic and Pacific,
Through Panama.
right?
So this legendary engineer, he's thinking, I conquered the deserts of Egypt. Now let's tame the jungles of Panama.
Something like that, but it didn't quite go as planned.
I bet. I mean, just thinking about the terrain and the logistics.
It was a nightmare, honestly. Dense jungles, landslides, then you have the diseases, yellow fever, malaria.
Oh, wow, that's brutal.
Thousands of lives were lost. The French effort ultimately went bankrupt.
That's a tragic reminder that ambition sometimes has a really high price.
Yeah,
But then the United States enters the picture.
exactly. Enter Theodore Roosevelt, a man with his own ambitions.
And wasn't Roosevelt like all about flexing America's muscles on the world stage?
Oh, absolutely. He saw the Panama Canal as this opportunity to assert U.S. dominance, create a navy that could move swiftly between the oceans.
I see. So strategic advantage, both military and economically.
Precisely.
But there was a snag, right? Because Panama wasn't independent at that time.
You're right. Panama was part of Colombia, and Colombia was not about to just hand over their land to the U.S. for a canal.
So what did the U.S. do? They weren't just going to back down, were they?
No, they weren't. It's a controversial move, but the U.S. ended up backing Panama's independence movement.
Really? So they directly got involved?
Yeah, under Roosevelt's direction. They even sent warships to keep Colombian forces from interfering.
Wow. That's a bold move. So essentially they were saying, hey, Colombia, mind your own business while we make a deal here.
You could say that.
But what did this mean for Panama, though? I mean, they basically traded one ruler for another, right?
But that's an important point. Panama got their independence, but they then signed a treaty with the U.S., gave them control of this 10-mile strip of land, the Panama Canal Zone.
So that became U.S. territory.
Effectively, created a nation within a nation.
You could see how that might cause some friction down the road.
Right.
A foreign power controlling such a crucial part of your country. But let's step back for a second. I mean, we've talked about military strategy, but why else was the U.S. so determined to build this canal? It wasn't just about battleships, was it?
Oh, no, the economic impact was massive. Before the canal, ships had to go all the way around South America. That's a long and dangerous journey.
Right, I can imagine.
The canal slashed shipping times, saved huge amounts of money. It reshaped global trade.
Okay, so we're not just talking about battleships. We're talking about money, trade routes. Who controls the flow of goods around the world?
You got it. And the U.S. collected tolls from every ship using the canal, generated massive revenue for them, solidified the canal's economic importance.
So military power, economic dominance, and a hefty income stream. Sounds like the U.S. hit the jackpot. But you mentioned friction earlier. This control wasn't going to last forever, was it?
Not at all. As the decades passed, resentment started growing within Panama. They saw the canal zone as the symbol of U.S. imperialism, led to protests and even riots.
Yeah, I can imagine the issue of who really controlled Panama's destiny. That had to be a major source of tension.
It definitely was.
I mean, just living with this symbol of foreign control every day, it's like a constant reminder that a piece of your country isn't really yours. So when did things really come to a head?
Well, the 1964 riots, those were a turning point. They forced the U.S. to reevaluate the whole situation, its relationship with Panama.
Okay, things are starting to heat up. We've got simmering resentment, protests, and now full-blown riots. What happens next in this geopolitical drama? What did the U.S. do?
Well, you have to remember the context. The Cold War was in full swing. Yeah, the Cold War was a huge factor. The U.S., they couldn't really afford to have instability so close to home.
So it wasn't just about, like, doing the right thing.
No, no, there were definitely strategic calculations involved.
Interesting.
The U.S. needed to stabilize the region and also, address Panama's concerns.
Right.
Legitimate grievances, really.
Yeah.
And this led to a lot of back and forth
Huh.
negotiations.
Okay.
And finally, the Torrijos-Carter treaties in 1977.
Okay, so this was a pretty significant shift in U.S. policy then.
Absolutely.
Okay, tell me more about these treaties. What did they actually change?
Well, they basically set the stage for Panama to eventually take control of the canal.
Okay.
And it wasn't just a simple handover.
Right.
It was about recognizing Panama's sovereignty,
Uh-huh.
their right to control their own destiny. It was
Yeah.
a step towards, righting a historical wrong.
So it sounds like a gradual process then. When did Panama actually fully take over?
It happened on December 31st, 1999.
Oh, man.
Kind of a symbolic date, right?
Yeah, eve of a new millennium.
And Panama finally in control of this crucial waterway.
It does feel like a major turning point in their history. But even with that, even with the canal under Panamanian control, did the U.S. truly, relinquish all of its influence?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's definitely more nuanced than a clean break.
Okay.
I mean, Panama manages the canal's day-to-day operations now through what they call the Panama Canal Authority,
Okay.
the ACP, but the U.S. retains certain rights.
Okay, so it's not a complete separation. What does that continued involvement actually look like?
Well, the treaties grant the U.S. the right to defend the canal's neutrality.
So, if anything threatens the canal's operation.
Exactly.
So there's still a military component to this relationship. Does that influence extend beyond just military matters, though?
Oh, definitely. The U.S. maintains strong economic ties with Panama,
Uh-huh.
provides support for, canal security. And there's also the historical weight of the canal for the U.S.,
Right.
It's a reminder of their engineering prowess and their past role in the region. It's almost like, a parent watching over their grown child, kind of.
Right. Still a sense of pride and responsibility,
Yeah.
even after letting go.
I like that analogy, but just when you think this relationship couldn't get any more complex and another player enters the scene, China.
Ah, yes. China. A rising global power with a growing interest in those trade routes and strategic waterways.
Yeah.
How has China become involved in Panama?
Well, China's been steadily expanding its influence in Latin America, and Panama is no exception.
Uh-huh.
There's a major Chinese shipping company,
Okay.
COSCO.
Costco.
They've been securing significant contracts, related to the canal. They're managing container terminals, increasing their footprint in the area.
So for our listeners who might not be as familiar with the shipping world, can you quickly explain what Costco is and why their presence in Panama is raising eyebrows?
Sure. So COSCO, they're a giant in the shipping industry,
Okay.
one of the largest companies moving goods globally.
Wow.
And their presence in Panama, especially around the canal, it's definitely raised some concerns in Washington.
I can imagine.
It signals China's ambitions, to become a major player in global trade and logistics.
So now we've got this three-way dynamic.
Right.
The U.S. trying to hold on to its historical influence, China seeking to expand its reach, and Panama navigating these competing interests. That's got to be tough.
Well, it's a delicate balancing act for Panama.
Yeah.
They have to protect their sovereignty, their economic interests, while also managing those relationships with these powerful nations.
It makes you wonder if the Torrijos-Carter treaties, designed for a different era, could have anticipated this new world order.
That's a good point. Those treaties, they were born in a time of the Cold War and Panama's fight for sovereignty. Today's world, it's shaped by globalization, economic interdependence, and the rise of new powers, like China.
Right.
The canal is now this focal point in this evolving landscape.
So let's talk about the future then. Climate change, shifting trade patterns, global power dynamics, all converging on the Panama Canal. What's the outlook? What are we looking at?
Well, the canal itself is facing some serious challenges.
Mhm.
Climate change is bringing more frequent droughts, you see,
Right.
and those impact the canal's water levels. They could
Right.
disrupt shipping traffic.
I remember reading about those droughts. They actually had to impose restrictions on how deep ships could sit in the water.
Exactly. To conserve water in the canal's reservoirs.
It's pretty incredible to think that something like that, like environmental changes, can directly impact global trade.
It really shows how interconnected everything is. And on top of climate change, there's the challenge of competition.
Oh, right. Like other routes.
Alternative trade routes are opening up,
Okay.
particularly that Arctic passage.
Yeah, right.
It's becoming more navigable as the polar ice melts.
So global warming could, ironically, make the Panama Canal less important. Who would have thought?
It's definitely a possibility, but the Panama Canal Authority, they're not just sitting back.
Right.
They're working to adapt, to stay competitive.
They completed a major expansion project back in 2016, didn't they? I remember seeing pictures of those massive new locks
Yes, that's right.
that can handle those supersized container ships.
Exactly. They increased the canal's capacity significantly with that expansion. They can accommodate those huge new Panamax ships that are essential for global trade now. It was a strategic investment in the canal's future.
It's like they're saying, hey, world, we're still a major player here.
Yeah, we can handle the biggest ships, remain a vital link in that global supply chain.
Smart move. But I'm still curious, how will the U.S. handle this increasingly complex situation? They're dealing with China's growing influence, climate change's unpredictable effects, and a future that's becoming harder and harder to predict. What's their strategy? How do they play this?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
The U.S. is facing a real dilemma. On one hand, they want to uphold the Torrijos-Carter treaties.
Right. Respect Panama's sovereignty.
Exactly. But on the other hand, they're wary of China's growing influence, the potential threat to their own interests.
Right, so it's a balancing act. They're trying to maintain their presence and influence without seeming like they're interfering.
Exactly. How do you strike that balance?
Yeah.
Do you focus on strengthening alliances with Panama and other regional partners to counter China's influence?
Right.
Do you increase military presence in the area but risk escalating things?
Yeah.
Fueling anti-American sentiment? Or do you take a more hands-off approach, hoping that those economic ties and diplomacy are enough?
Those are some tough choices. No easy answers there. And it seems like the U.S.'s history in Panama, marked by intervention and control, just adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing.
Absolutely. It's not just about the political and economic interests at play here. There's a moral dimension, too.
Yeah, for sure.
How does the U.S. reconcile its past actions with its current commitment to respecting Panama's sovereignty?
That's a really good question. It seems like they're grappling with their legacy while also trying to navigate the present and prepare for an uncertain future.
And that brings us to a crucial point for you, the listener. We've been exploring the history, the geopolitics of the Panama Canal, but what does all of this actually mean for you?
Right. This isn't just some story in a far-off corner of the world. This affects all of us.
How?
Well, for starters, the Panama Canal, it impacts how much things cost,
It does.
the speed of shipping,
Right.
and even whether or not you can buy certain products.
Yeah.
If there's a disruption to the canal,
Right.
whether it's from a drought or political instability or whatever,
Yeah.
that can have ripple effects
Huge ripple effects.
that reach you directly as a consumer.
Exactly. It just underscores how interconnected our world really is.
Yeah.
Decisions made, events that happen around the Panama Canal, they can impact your everyday life in ways you might not even think about.
It's crazy when you think about it that way. So it's not just about, history and geopolitics.
Right.
It's about understanding how the world really works,
Right.
the things we rely on.
Uh-huh.
So as we wrap up here, let's try to distill some key takeaways from our dive into the Panama Canal.
Yeah.
What are some of the big things our listeners should remember?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that it's a testament to human ingenuity.
Yeah.
It's a symbol of what we can achieve.
Uh-huh.
Overcoming incredible challenges to literally connect the world. I mean, think about it. They carved a path through a jungle.
It's mind-blowing
Yeah.
when you think about the scale of it all.
And they changed global trade forever.
For sure, for sure. But it's also important to remember that this story, it's wrapped up in colonialism,
It is, yes.
power dynamics.
Definitely.
The U.S. played a big role
A crucial role.
in creating the canal, but it wasn't without its controversies.
Right.
And it had some lasting impacts on Panama.
It did, yeah.
It's a good reminder that even amazing achievements can have a complicated history
They do.
and some ethical implications that we need to really think about.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to grapple with the full story, not just the celebratory parts of it.
For sure, for sure. And, speaking of complexities, the control of the canal today, it's not simple either.
It isn't, though.
Panama has sovereignty over the waterway, but the U.S. still has its interest in the region.
Definitely.
And now we've got China's growing presence, adding another layer to the whole thing.
Another layer to the geopolitical chessboard.
It really shows how global power is constantly shifting. It does, yeah. And no one nation really has complete control anymore.
It's a world of constant negotiation, competing interests.
So where does that leave the future of the Panama Canal? We've talked about the challenges from climate change, competition from those other trade routes,
Yeah.
and all these geopolitical rivalries. Makes you wonder, what role will the canal play in the years to come?
It's a big question. Will it still be this vital artery of global trade? Or will it fade in importance as the world keeps changing?
Tough to say.
It really is.
Well, here's something for everyone listening to think about. The story of the Panama Canal, it's not over yet. It's still being written.
Exactly.
It's this living, evolving testament to how interconnected we are.
It is, yeah.
And the canal's future depends on the choices that we make,
Yeah.
as a global community.
That's a really good point.
Well, I think that's a powerful note to leave our listeners on. The Panama Canal, it's more than just a waterway.
It is, yeah.
It's a reflection of our history,
Yeah.
where we are today,
Yeah.
and all those challenges and opportunities that are ahead of us.
Exactly.
Hopefully this deep dive has given you a new perspective on this fascinating and incredibly important part of the world. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.